Power doesn't always wear medals. Sometimes it arrives in silence, wrapped in dust, armed with clarity. In the age of over-polished presidents and AI-written speeches, Ibrahim Traoré came like a glitch in the system. No political dynasty, no Ivy League, no Western blessing. Just a captain, young, firm-eyed, uninvited, from a land the global elite had safely tucked away in the irrelevant folder. Burkina Faso. Where is that again? Most Westerners had to Google it. The same people who can recite the GDP of Norway but can't point to Ouagadougou on a map suddenly had to say the name of a country they've ignored for decades. And then came the headlines. Young military officer takes power. Anti-French sentiment rising in the Sahel. New face of African defiance? But they still didn't get it. They called him a junta leader. They called him a populist. Some went as far as suggesting he was Moscow's new puppet. Because to many in the West, if an African refuses to kneel, someone else must be pulling his strings. Autonomy? That's too wild a concept to entertain. Traoré didn't arrive with fanfare. He arrived with intention. He didn't scream nationalism. He lived it. And while others posed with photo ops in Paris or Washington, he stood in the Sahel, boots deep in red earth, speaking about sovereignty like it actually meant something. Was he flawless? Number. But maybe that's the point. The West has adored its polished monsters for centuries. Men in suits who drop bombs with smiles. Traoré was different. Unrefined, unbought, and, most dangerously, unafraid. And what rattled them most wasn't just his rhetoric, it was his calm. He wasn't burning flags. He wasn't begging for sanctions relief. He wasn't even playing the Cold War game, East versus West. He was speaking a third language, the language of independence, that rare, expensive tongue many African leaders have forgotten or sold off. So when the time came, and he stood eye to eye with Vladimir Putin, yes, that Putin, the world held its breath. What would this young African captain say to the man many fear, flatter, or fake smile for? What he said, and what he didn't, is where this story truly begins. Because this is not just about Traoré. This is about a continent daring to speak for itself. Not in whispers, not in translation, but in thunder. And the thunder this time came from Burkina Faso. And what about the critics? Of course they were ready. Naive idealist, some scoffed. A destabilizing force, muttered others, wary of upsetting the delicate balance of global power. But Traoré's response was as sharp as it was simple. Results matter more than rhetoric. In towns and villages, people began to feel the difference. Roads that once were mere dirt paths became arteries of commerce. Schools once overcrowded and underfunded saw new teachers and updated curricula. The energy sector, long plagued by outages, started flickering with hope. Solar projects, small hydroelectric dams, and a commitment to sustainability. This was no accident. It was the product of relentless vision and tactical patience. What's fascinating about Traoré's revolution is how it flips the script on what leadership in Africa has historically looked like. Gone were the days of leaders relying solely on charisma or populist promises. Instead, here was a leader who wielded policy like a scalpel, precise, effective, and unafraid to make hard decisions. It's also worth noting the subtle, often overlooked dimension of his strategy, the use of narrative. Traoré understood that power is as much about perception as it is about policy. By consistently framing Africa's story as one of empowerment and dignity, he countered centuries of damaging stereotypes. And that's where the true genius lies. He didn't just seek to change policies, he sought to change minds, both within Africa and beyond. His speeches, laced with quiet wit and piercing insight, challenged audiences to reconsider their assumptions. Africa, he argued, wasn't a charity case, nor a pawn in geopolitical chess. It was a continent on the move, demanding respect and partnership on its own terms. As his influence grew, so did the unease among established powers. Some responded with overt hostility, sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and even covert attempts to undermine his agenda. Others tried a more subtle approach, offering deals wrapped in empty promises. But Traoré was no novice to these games. He met pressure with resilience, refusal with resolve. Every setback became a stepping stone, every challenge an opportunity to reaffirm his vision. So here's the essential takeaway from this phase of the story. Ibrahim Traoré's rise was not a sudden blaze, but a steady, purposeful flame, one that warmed those who believed in Africa's potential and unsettled those clinging to old paradigms. In a world awash with noise, his quiet revolution spoke volumes. In a world where headlines are dominated by fiery rhetoric and grandstanding diplomacy, Ibrahim Traoré's approach seemed almost quaint. But don't let the calm fool you. Beneath that steady gaze and measured tone lies a revolution quietly reshaping the very foundations of power. While the global stage buzzed with bluster, world leaders squabbling like school children over trade deals and military posturing, Traoré was building something far more enduring. Not with bombast, but with deliberate, strategic moves that would leave even the most seasoned diplomats scratching their heads. You see, the great irony of Traoré's rise is how little fanfare accompanied it. No flashy announcements or dramatic coup d'etat. Instead, a steady wave of reforms that touched every corner of governance, every layer of society. It was the kind of change that doesn't scream for attention, but demands respect. His first act? To dismantle decades of inertia, entrenched bureaucracies, slow to respond and quick to obstruct, suddenly found themselves facing a leader who wouldn't tolerate excuses. Corruption, that age-old parasite that has gnawed at Africa's potential, was met with zero tolerance. Not just lip service, but real accountability. Arrests of high-profile officials, transparent audits, and a new culture of responsibility. But Traoré's revolution wasn't just about rooting out the old rot. It was about planting seeds for the future. Education, innovation, infrastructure, these became the pillars of his vision. Instead of begging for foreign aid, he sought partnerships that respected Africa's agency. He understood that true sovereignty means more than political independence. It means economic self-reliance. There's a certain poetic justice in how Traoré turned the tables on the traditional power brokers. Where once Africa was the recipient of conditional aid, now it was a player with leverage. Deals were brokered not under the shadow of dependency, but from a position of strength. A strategic pivot that sent ripples through diplomatic circles. In the grand theater of international politics, where titans like Putin and Biden play their high-stakes games, Ibrahim Traoré steps onto the stage with an unexpected script. While many might expect him to be a mere pawn, easily sidelined or overshadowed, Traoré rewrites the narrative, turning the game on its head with a mix of cunning, courage, and an unshakable sense of purpose. The global powers had long treated Africa as the periphery, a land of resources to be extracted, crises to be managed, or alliances to be brokered under their terms. Traoré's arrival challenges that tired script. Suddenly, the continent is not just a backdrop, but a player with agency, a force demanding respect rather than pity. Putin, accustomed to dealing with pliable leaders and predictable alliances, found himself facing a different kind of interlocutor. Traoré's refusal to bow to pressure, be it through military threats, economic sanctions, or diplomatic isolation, unsettled the Kremlin. It was a reminder that power is not always wielded through brute force. Sometimes it's the steadfast refusal to submit that speaks loudest. Across the Atlantic, Western capitals watched warily as Traoré navigated a delicate dance. His message was clear. Africa would no longer be a passive recipient of Western goodwill or interference. Instead, it would chart its own course, based on sovereignty and mutual respect. This was not a declaration of defiance for defiance's sake, but a strategic recalibration long overdue. But how did Traoré manage to balance this tightrope? The answer lies in his nuanced diplomacy. Unlike many leaders who brandish ideology like a weapon, Traoré wields pragmatism as his shield. He understands the complexities of global politics and uses them to Africa's advantage, seeking partnerships that elevate rather than diminish. It's a bold gambit, Engaging with Russia and China without alienating the West requires finesse few possess. Yet Traoré's approach is less about playing one power against another, and more about leveraging competition to secure better terms for his people. In other words, Africa becomes the deal maker, not the deal breaker. This strategy, however, invites criticism from all sides. Western pundits decry his unpredictability and question his allegiances, while rivals brand him a stooge or accuse him of reckless brinkmanship. But beneath the noise lies a simple truth. Traoré's primary allegiance is to Africa's future, not to external power blocks. His ability to stand firm in the face of pressure has earned him admiration at home and unease abroad. It's a testament to a new kind of leadership, one that rejects subservience and demands partnership. Of course, the stakes are high. In the complex game of geopolitics, missteps can lead to isolation or conflict. But Traoré's calculated risks reflect a leader who understands that progress requires courage, even when it means standing alone. As the world watches, one thing is clear. Traoré is not just playing the game, he's changing its rules. And in doing so, he inspires a vision of Africa that refuses to be defined by others. A continent asserting its rightful place in the global order. There's a moment in every chess match when one player suddenly realizes they're not playing against a pawn. That moment came for the Kremlin when Ibrahim Traoré, calm as a monk and sharp as a scalpel, refused to speak in rehearsed diplomatic code. No empty pleasantries, no smiling for the cameras. He was not here to entertain Cold War nostalgia. While Putin opened with the usual display, subtle nods to anti-imperialism, warnings about Western sabotage, and an offer of Russian military aid disguised as strategic partnership, Traoré didn't blink. He wasn't flattered. He was focused. He looked Russia's leader in the eye and said, in essence, Africa doesn't need new masters. It needs old chains broken. You could feel the Kremlin's temperature drop a few degrees, because this wasn't Mali in 2012, begging for troops. This wasn't the Central African Republic signing away mineral rights for military uniforms. This was Burkina Faso under Traoré, a man who had buried fear alongside colonial decorum. The silence in the room said it all. Putin, a master of posturing, suddenly found himself outperformed. Because while he played empire with veiled smiles, Traoré played liberation with fire in his voice and clarity in his convictions. He wasn't buying into the BRICS fantasy, not without asking the hard questions. Will you respect our sovereignty or simply exploit it differently? Are we partners or is this just another auction? These questions weren't rhetorical. They were revolutionary. And for the first time, Putin faced an African leader who didn't see Russia as an escape route from the West, but as another shadow to be inspected. No automatic trust, no blind allegiance. Just one principle: self-determination first, alliances later. It wasn't defiance for the cameras. It was doctrine. In that moment, you could see the old rules of global politics, crafted in European capitals, polished in Washington, occasionally whispered in Moscow, begin to fracture. Because Traoré wasn't here to please the East or shame the West. He was here to build a continent that answered to neither. The room was thick with tension, but outside the Kremlin walls, something far bigger was unfolding. Africa was waking up. For decades, the continent had been a chessboard, pawns shuffled by powers far away, while the real players made deals in smoky backrooms. But Traoré was rewriting the rulebook. His message was simple yet revolutionary. Africa will no longer be the silent victim of global power plays. And that message was resonating, far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. The West, with its endless lectures on democracy and good governance, watched nervously. Russia, used to easy influence, recoiled in surprise. China, quietly observing, weighed its own ambitions. But Traoré was unfazed. His stance wasn't just about power. It was about dignity, about reclaiming the right to define Africa's future, without foreign strings attached. He knew that standing firm meant more than words. It demanded action. Traoré launched reforms that rattled entrenched interests, both at home and abroad. He cut deals with neighboring countries, building alliances based on mutual respect and shared vision, not transactional dependency. He invested in local industries, insisting that African resources serve African people first, and he pushed for military self-reliance, a clear message to those who still imagine Africa as a playground for mercenaries and proxy wars. This wasn't just politics. This was a declaration. The old script was over. Western aid, once seen as a lifeline, was now scrutinized for strings attached. Russia's promises of partnership were exposed as thinly veiled attempts to reclaim lost influence. Even China's massive infrastructure projects faced new demands: transparency, local ownership, and fair labor practices. Traoré's boldness inspired other leaders too. Suddenly, a new wave of African voices emerged, unapologetic, fearless, demanding a seat at the global table on their own terms. The irony? While some Western commentators dismissed Traoré as a radical or unrealistic, the truth was the opposite. He was simply daring to do what was once unimaginable: treat Africa as a continent of equals, not as a source of endless resources or geopolitical chess pieces. And this shift terrified the old powers. They responded with a familiar playbook: disinformation campaigns, economic pressure, even threats. But Traoré's resolve only hardened. With every attack, he turned the spotlight on the hypocrisies of global politics. He reminded the world that African sovereignty wasn't a gift, it was a right. In this new era, the question wasn't whether Africa would rise. It was how the rest of the world would adjust to a continent that refused to be pushed around. And Traoré? He was leading the charge, not with empty slogans or shallow rhetoric, but with a vision that was as sharp as it was unapologetic. Because in a world used to fearing African leaders who dared to be independent, Traoré wasn't just a leader, he was a symbol of what Africa could be: strong, self-reliant, unbowed. The world was watching, or at least it tried to. For decades, the global power dynamic was predictable. The West set the rules, Russia played spoiler, China quietly expanded its footprint, and Africa was the stage, never the actor. But Ibrahim Traoré had other plans. His bold moves disrupted the usual script, like a well-timed plot twist that no one saw coming. Suddenly, a new player demanded respect, not through wealth, not through brute force, but sheer audacity and unshakable resolve. This was no small matter. The old powers weren't just losing influence, they were losing face. The West, with its endless campaigns of democracy promotion and human rights, faced a painful irony. Here was a leader who wasn't bowing to their demands, but whose legitimacy was rooted in genuine popular support. Traoré didn't play the usual game of compromises and empty promises. He held a mirror up to the global order, exposing hypocrisies and double standards with a smirk sharp enough to cut through diplomatic niceties. And then there was Putin, the man who prided himself on geopolitical cunning. Putin's Russia was used to being feared, manipulating proxy wars, and reasserting influence wherever possible. Yet Traoré's defiance was different. It wasn't just political posturing, it was a declaration of independence that resonated deeply in a continent long denied agency. The Kremlin's reaction was telling: frustration mixed with grudging respect. For all his bluster, Putin understood that Traoré represented a new reality. Africa would no longer be a pawn in Moscow's game. But it wasn't just about Russia or the West. China's massive Belt and Road ambitions faced a subtle but firm challenge. Traoré insisted on transparency, local control, and fair labor practices in Chinese projects, conditions that rattled Beijing's usual unchecked influence. Africa was no longer the easy market or resource reservoir it once was. It was becoming a player that demanded fairness and partnership on its own terms. And that shift sent ripples far beyond the continent. In capitals from Washington to Beijing, the message was clear: Africa was changing, and the old playbook was obsolete. This upheaval ignited a scramble. Diplomats, intelligence agencies, and corporations all trying to recalibrate strategies in real time. But Traoré didn't flinch. Instead, he doubled down. He invested in regional integration, building coalitions not through force, but through shared interests and mutual respect. He championed homegrown solutions to security challenges, refusing to rely on foreign mercenaries or external powers with hidden agendas. His rhetoric wasn't just fiery speeches. It was backed by action. And that action was transforming the continent's image, from a passive recipient of aid to a confident actor on the global stage. Of course, this new reality wasn't without resistance. Traoré faced economic sanctions, covert smear campaigns, and diplomatic isolation attempts. But he met these attacks with the same sharp wit and unwavering confidence that defined his leadership. He turned every challenge into an opportunity to highlight global injustices and to rally his people. Traoré wasn't just fighting for Burkina Faso. He was fighting for a new world order where African voices mattered. And in doing so, he was reshaping how the world viewed power, sovereignty, and respect. The old powers, accustomed to wielding influence through fear and dependency, found themselves facing a leader who wielded something far more potent: legitimacy. In the end, Traoré's challenge to the global order was more than political. It was philosophical. It asked the uncomfortable question: what does true power look like in the 21st century? Is it the ability to dominate through force and wealth? Or is it the courage to stand firm, demand respect, and chart your own path? Traoré's Africa chose the latter. And as the world watched, some reluctantly admitted, this was a shift they could neither ignore nor undo. As the dust settled on the geopolitical battlefield, one truth became undeniably clear. Ibrahim Traoré wasn't just a leader, he was a symbol of defiance, resilience, and a refusal to be relegated to the sidelines of history. For too long, Africa had been cast as a passive bystander in a world dominated by superpowers. The narrative was always the same: aid dependency, proxy conflicts, and whispered promises of development that never quite arrived. Traoré shattered this tired script with the force of a thunderclap. His leadership heralded a new dawn, a dawn where Africa began to write its own stories, unapologetically bold, fiercely independent, and deeply rooted in its own unique realities. But with great change comes great skepticism. The world was quick to question whether this new Africa could sustain its momentum, or if it would succumb to the familiar traps of corruption, external manipulation, or internal divisions. Traoré acknowledged these risks but refused to be paralyzed by fear or cynicism. Instead, he challenged his people to rise, not just as subjects of history, but as its authors. His vision was clear: a continent united not by colonial borders or foreign agendas, but by shared purpose and collective ambition. In this grand narrative, Traoré understood that true power was not wielded through brute strength alone, but through the ability to inspire, to unite, and to envision a future worth fighting for. His administration prioritized education, innovation, and sustainable development, investing in young minds that would become the architects of tomorrow's Africa. He fostered regional partnerships that transcended old rivalries, recognizing that strength lay in unity rather than division. And yet, Traoré's journey was not merely about governance. It was about reclaiming dignity on the global stage. His presence forced the world to reconsider long-held assumptions that Africa was a continent to be saved rather than one that could save itself. There was a subtle, yet profound revolution happening, one that was as much about changing hearts and minds as it was about shifting policies and borders. Through his sharp wit and unflinching resolve, Traoré became a living rebuke to the old guard's complacency. He was a reminder that leadership grounded in authenticity and courage could disrupt even the most entrenched power structures. So, what does this new chapter mean for the world? For Africa, it means a chance to reclaim agency, to break free from the shadows of dependency, and to step confidently into the light of self-determination. For the West, Russia, and China, it's a warning. The era of easy influence is over. Engage with Africa as equals, or risk being sidelined by a continent that has found its voice. And for the rest of us, Traoré's story is a testament to the power of resilience, a call to question the narratives we accept and to celebrate those who dare to rewrite them. In the end, the clash between Ibrahim Traoré and the old global order wasn't just a political battle, it was a profound moment of reckoning, of a moment when Africa stood tall and said, "We are here. We will shape our destiny." And that perhaps is the greatest story of all.